So here's the thing about Margaret Thatcher. She'd won 3 elections, she'd broken the miners' strike, people called her the Iron Lady, and in November 1990, she was forced out of office, crying as she left 10 Downing Street. What happened? A tax. But not just any tax. A tax so wildly unpopular that 18 million people broke the law to fight it. Let's back up to 1987. Thatcher had just won her 3rd term, and one of her big campaign promises was introducing something called the community charge. Nobody called it that, though. Everyone called it the poll tax, named after a medieval tax from 1381 that literally sparked a peasants' revolt. That should have been a warning sign, right? Here's what the poll tax actually was. Before this, people in the UK paid something called rates, basically a local tax based on the value of your home. If you lived in a bigger, more expensive house, you paid more. If your house were smaller and worth less, you would pay less. Made sense. It was a system that had been around since the 1600s. But Thatcher wanted to change all that. She wanted everyone, and I mean everyone over 18, to pay the exact same amount. Didn't matter if you were a millionaire in a mansion or a student in a cramped flat. Didn't matter if you were unemployed or working 3 jobs. Same charge for everyone. Now, Thatcher and her supporters tried to spin this as making things fairer. They said, why should a duke pay more than a dustman? But when you actually think about it, that's bonkers. It was estimated that Thatcher's own family in Dulwich would save £2,300 a year, while working-class families with adult sons or daughters still living at home could end up with bills hundreds of pounds higher. Students who'd never paid any local tax, now they had to pay. The unemployed, they had to pay. People living with disabilities on benefits, they had to pay too. Everyone paid 80% of the full charge, with only a 20% reduction for students and people on benefits. So, where do you test out a massively unpopular idea? If you're the Tories, you pick Scotland. The tax was introduced in Scotland in 1989, a full year before it came to England and Wales. The Conservatives barely had any support in Scotland anyway, so I guess they figured, what did they have to lose? They lost, badly. When the tax was implemented in spring 1989 in Scotland, concerned citizens immediately formed anti-poll tax unions, APTUs. These weren't run by big political parties. They were neighborhood groups set up on council estates, in towns and villages, regular people sitting around in pubs and community centers trying to figure out how to fight this thing. And they came up with a strategy that the government never saw coming. Mass non-payment. Just don't pay it. When the tax was introduced in Scotland, around 1 million out of the country's 4 million people refused to pay. Think about that. That's 25% of the entire adult population of Scotland just saying no. The key thing here, and this is what made it work, is that it wasn't just a few prominent people refusing to pay as some kind of political statement. It was millions of ordinary people, mums and dads, young people, pensioners. The strategy was simple. Unite the people who literally couldn't afford to pay with the people who wouldn't pay on principle. Safety in numbers. In November 1989, a national organization called the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation was set up, largely organized by a group called Militant, a far-left organization within the Labour Party. Tommy Sheridan became the chair. The first conference attracted around 2,000 delegates, all fired up and ready to spread the non-payment campaign from Scotland to the rest of the UK. Now, you might be wondering, what did the Labour Party say about all this? Surely they opposed this terrible tax? Well, yes and no. Labour politicians made speeches condemning the poll tax, but when it came to actually supporting non-payment, at their 1988 annual conference, the Labour Party decided against supporting a non-payment campaign. Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader, actually called non-payers lawbreakers. Even after the whole thing was over, when Labour MP Terry Fields went to jail for refusing to pay, Kinnock said, lawmakers must not be lawbreakers. So regular people were basically on their own, organizing from the ground up. By 1990, it was England and Wales's turn. The tax was due to come into effect on April 1st. Councils were already setting their rates, and people were seeing what they'd actually have to pay, and it was worse than anyone thought. The government had said the average poll tax would be around £180 per person per year. But when it actually came into effect in 1990, the average was about £360 per person per year, literally double what they'd promised. Think about what that means for a family. Say you've got two parents and two adult kids all living in the same small house. Before, they paid one bill based on the house value. Now, 4 separate bills. It could be as high as £1,400 per year. And maybe they'd been paying £400 before. That's not a tax increase, that's a crisis. Demonstrations started happening everywhere, not just in big cities. We're talking sleepy towns in southern England that had never seen protests before. 2,000 people turned out in Maidenhead to denounce their Tory MP, calling him the Ceausescu of Maidenhead for supporting the tax. Ceausescu was the Romanian dictator who'd just been overthrown and executed a few months earlier. People weren't messing around. In March 1990, things started getting violent. On March 6th, a 5,000-strong demonstration in Bristol escalated into clashes, with mounted police charging the crowd. 26 people were arrested. The next day in Hackney, police baton-charged demonstrators, which turned the protest into a riot. 50 shop windows were smashed, and 56 people were arrested. This was happening all over. Protesters were storming council chambers, forcing meetings to be called off. But here's the thing. None of it stopped the tax from being implemented. The councils went ahead with it anyway. So we get to March 31st, 1990, 1 week before the poll tax officially came into force in England and Wales. The All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation organized a massive demonstration in London. 3 days before, they realized the turnout was going to be way bigger than the 60,000 people Trafalgar Square could hold. They asked permission to move the march to Hyde Park, but the police refused because they had already made preparations for Trafalgar Square. People started arriving around 11 in the morning. The total crowd reached about 200,000 people. Some estimates put it even higher. It was one of the biggest demonstrations London had seen in a century. The organizers had distributed over 1 million leaflets and posters. They had filled 1,000 coaches and several trains just to get people there. This was not some small fringe group. This was a massive, organized movement. The march itself started peacefully. People were angry, sure, but it was still just a march. Then, around 4 in the afternoon, things changed. According to multiple accounts, mounted riot police charged out of a side street into the crowd in Trafalgar Square. Whether this was intentional or not, protesters saw it as a provocation. The police had already been pushing sections of the crowd into corners with no way out except through police lines. Then, at 4:30 in the afternoon, 4 shielded police riot vans drove straight into the crowd outside the South African embassy, trying to force their way through to Whitehall, where police were regrouping. People attacked the vans with whatever they had, wooden staves and scaffolding poles. And then it just exploded. The builders' cabins in the square were set on fire. Parts of the South African embassy went up in flames. The fighting spilled out into nearby streets. Shops were attacked, including Stringfellow's nightclub and car showrooms. Cafes and wine bars in Covent Garden got torched, along with cars. This went on for hours. By midnight, official figures said 113 people were injured, mostly members of the public, but also police officers. 339 people had been arrested. Scuffles between rioters and police continued until 3 in the morning. Now, the government's immediate response was to blame outside agitators. Thatcher called them rent-a-mob extremists. The media called it a riot. The socialist groups blamed the police. Everyone was pointing fingers. But here's what's interesting. A campaign group called the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign acquired 50 hours of security camera footage, and parts of it showed police officers launching unprovoked attacks on demonstrators. So it was not as simple as rioters went crazy. And here's the other thing. The riot itself, as dramatic as it was not actually what defeated the poll tax. The real battle was about to begin. After Trafalgar Square, the media was obsessed with the violence. But what was actually happening across the country was something much more powerful and organized. At its height, 18 million people were defying the law and refusing to pay the poll tax. Let me put that in perspective. The United Kingdom's adult population at the time was maybe 45 million. That means roughly 40% of all adults were just not paying. Not secretly either. Openly, defiantly not paying. In the tax's first year, £1,200,000,000 of tax went unpaid in England and Wales alone. Councils had no idea what to do. Some areas saw non-payment rates of 40 to 50%. In London, it was even higher. By August 1990, 1 in 5 of the entire population had refused to pay, with figures reaching 27% in London. The anti-poll tax unions taught people exactly what to do. If you got summoned to court, show up, but bring hundreds of other non-payers with you to clog up the court system. Use special, slow-to-process checks. If bailiffs came, sell your furniture to a friend for £1, so there is nothing to confiscate. An estimated 1 million people removed their names from the electoral roll entirely just to avoid the tax. The courts could not handle it. The first big test came on the Isle of Wight, where the court threw out 1,800 summonses for non-payment all at once. Think about that. The system just could not function. By November 1990, South Yorkshire Police said they were planning to refuse to arrest poll tax defaulters, even when courts ordered them to, because it would be physically impossible given the huge numbers. The police literally said, "We can't do this." Some people did get jailed. Hundreds were sent to jail, including many militant supporters. Terry Fields, a Labour MP who was part of Militant, got imprisoned for 60 days for refusing to pay. But compared to the millions who refused to pay, it was nothing. Prison governors did not want poll tax non-payers in their jails anyway. They were worried these people would stir things up inside. Labor councils were supposed to collect the tax, and they did. Labor councils sent bailiffs into working-class people's homes to take their property. They jailed people who could not pay. So much for standing with workers. The only people actually fighting this were the grassroots organizers and the millions of regular people who just said no. So we have got riots in London, we have got millions not paying, and Thatcher, she was at a Conservative Party conference in Cheltenham when Trafalgar Square kicked off. The poll tax was the focus of the conference, and as coverage of the demonstrations unfolded, speculation began for the first time about Thatcher's position as leader. Her approval ratings were in freefall. Labour had taken a commanding lead in the opinion polls after the poll tax was announced. We are talking about a 23-point lead after the Trafalgar Square riot. In March 1990, a by-election in Mid-Staffordshire turned a 14,654 Tory majority into a 9,449 Labour majority. That is not just losing. That is a complete wipeout. And the exit polls were clear. People were voting against the Tories because of the poll tax. Even within her own party, Conservatives were panicking. Some ministers started quietly discussing abolishing the poll tax, but they knew it would not be possible while Thatcher was still Prime Minister. The tax was her flagship policy. She had staked her entire reputation on it. There were also big divisions in the Conservative Party about Europe at this time. Geoffrey Howe, one of her longest-serving ministers, resigned in October 1990, specifically because of Thatcher's hostile approach to European integration. But do not let anyone fool you. Europe was the excuse. The poll tax was the real crisis. On November 14, 1990, Michael Heseltine, a former Defense and Environment Secretary who had opposed the poll tax, challenged Thatcher for leadership of the Conservative Party. Thatcher was in France for a summit when the vote happened. She had to vote by proxy. And when the results came in, she won by 50 votes. But she narrowly missed the threshold needed to avoid a second ballot. That should have been enough. She won, right? But in Conservative Party leadership challenges, you need to win by a certain margin to finish it in one round. She did not have that margin, which meant a second vote was coming. Thatcher consulted with her cabinet, and one by one, they told her the truth. She was not going to win the second ballot. The poll tax had destroyed her support, even among her own MPs. On November 22, 1990, she announced her resignation after more than a decade in office. There are famous photos of her crying as she was driven away from 10 Downing Street. The Sun newspaper, which had supported her since 1979, ran the headline, "Mrs. T. Ears," showing her in tears. Labour leader Neil Kinnock said her resignation was good, very, very good indeed, and called for an immediate general election. Even Henry Kissinger, the American politician, was apparently so upset he called it worse than a death in the family. But the reality was simple. The campaign against the poll tax, especially the mass non-payment involving 18 million people, had made her position completely untenable. The second round vote for Conservative leadership happened on November 27, 1990. All three candidates pledged to abolish the poll tax. John Major won. One of Major's first acts as Prime Minister was appointing Michael Heseltine, the guy who had challenged Thatcher, as Environment Secretary, specifically to replace the poll tax. In early 1991, the government announced it would raise VAT from 15% to 17.5% to pay for a 140-pound reduction in the poll tax. And then, on March 21st, 1991, they announced the poll tax would be abolished entirely. In 1993, it was replaced with the council tax, which, importantly, took property values into account again, dividing properties into different bands. Not perfect, but far more reasonable than everyone paying the same amount. That council tax system is still what the United Kingdom uses today, 32 years later. Now, some people got letters saying they still owed back poll tax payments. The campaign continued to support these people and campaign for the debts to be written off. Many were actually quietly dropped by councils later, because what were they going to do? Take millions of people to court? The poll tax riots of March 31st, 1990, with all their drama and violence made for good television, they are what people remember. But the real story of how Thatcher fell is not about one day of rioting in Trafalgar Square. It is about millions of people in towns and cities across Britain, sitting in community halls and pubs, deciding to refuse an unjust tax. It is about people organizing on council estates, distributing leaflets, showing up to court en masse, and forming human shields when bailiffs came around. It is about the slow, steady realization inside 10 Downing Street and Conservative Party headquarters that they had made a catastrophic mistake, that no amount of force was going to make this work, that the Iron Lady, who had broken the miners, was not going to break this. And ultimately, it is about the fact that power, real power, does not just come from the top down. When enough people at the bottom say no, things change. The poll tax tried to make everyone equal, equally poor, equally burdened. And the response? 18 million people saying collectively, can't pay, won't pay. That is how you topple an Iron Lady. Not with one riot, but with millions of ordinary people refusing to back down.